Welcome back, everyone. Very excited to welcome you back after our short break. We're going to start up with Rachid Laajaj and move on with two other speakers, Andrew Dillon and Lauren Bernquist. Very excited. Lauren will be joining us online. Yeah, we'll have her here, but hopefully we'll be able to integrate and make sure that if you have questions for Lauren, we'll be able to ask those questions of her. Okay, so I think this is kind of, can we make this as kind of disappear it as best we can? And then you should be able to just, why is it?
Click on it first, maybe.
Yeah, okay. So just use those. Oh, yeah, now you're good. Okay. Are you in the right spot?
Yep.
Thanks everyone for coming back in. Does anyone have any contraband coffee? I'll get in trouble.
Hi, everyone. Okay. So let's continue now and let's really dive into these sessions. Through this session, we wanted to learn about limited attention, complexity, also procrastination, all these issues, behavioral issues that tend to affect technology adoption. And let me put timer just to make sure that I don't exceed. Can you hear me well? Yeah. So let's really put things a little bit in a bigger picture. How do technology adoption and behavioral constraints interact? There's a large literature that believes that if farmer would adopt some of the innovations that are out there, that have been the seeds out there, the better fertilizers out there, you could do better, both in terms of reducing poverty and in many cases also in sustainable development, sustainable in the long run, sustainable with respect to the environment as well. There are many of these practices that could be more sustainable and that could also really help the farmers. And yet, it seems like many are not using. So the literature in agriculture is really interested in technology adoption because of this main belief that they could be substantially better off if only they would use some of the innovations that are out there. But in many cases, they don't. Or not as many as what is available. And so what are the reasons behind this? And there's a set of very practical constraints. Some tend to separate the sort of the financial constraint, the knowledge constraint, the risk constraint to other that are purely behavioral, but we actually think and want to present it as something that is very combined. In fact, the behavioral constraints tend to be the ones that make these constraints even harder to solve. And hence, sometimes, as it was mentioned before, some of the standard interventions that address some of the typical constraints don't work as well as we expected it to work, partly because of these behavioral constraints on top of the regular ones. So we have the literature really structures a lot around these constraints to adoption, from information, risk, financial constraint, profitability, input and output markets. Imagine you're a farmer and you're facing all of these obstacles at once. How do you solve most of this? And you have a behavioral as part of all this. Let's talk a little bit about the lack of information. We think of lack of information as one needs to know about the know-how and about the potential of the potential benefits that you would go from a technology. Potential benefits is what makes you decide whether you want to use it or not, because you would get higher yields or other qualities that you would get. But the know-how is, in order to reap these benefits, you actually need to know and to get enough practice. And when you get both at the same time, you're still figuring out how to use it, but you also have to figure out what is the long-term benefits if you actually, once you will learn this. So it makes it very complex. And we want to put ourselves in the shoes of the farmers who are facing these kind of issues when we deal with these kind of projects. So you have plenty of interventions that tend to say, okay, in this case, we need to promote learning, demo plots, field days, extension services, trainings. All of this have these objectives. We mentioned input subsidies because sometimes we think about bringing them the knowledge, but sometimes you just need a kind of helping them use it, helping them bear the cost of this learning. And the subsidies is also a way, an alternative to do these kind of things. And now some of the main challenges connected to behaviors are one, learning in the midst of noise, because you're changing many inputs at once in many seasons, typically, depending on what's available and your decisions. You're facing also changes in weather, in pests, and many conditions. And still you have limited attention in how much you can pay attention to all of this, right? So all these will add up. Adapting to the heterogeneity, perhaps one would say, okay, in this case, we should tell them what to do in some way. That's the idea of a credence good. So those who recommended the agronomist may know better, so that's how you deal with this. But the problem is that there is so much heterogeneity, meaning different conditions under which you should take different decisions, that if you have too much top-down decisions into this, then you're not tapping on their own knowledge about what is better for them, and knowledge about you need to combine these kind of theoretical knowledge of what kind of inputs may work better with the heterogeneity and the own trying of these conditions. And this is, given the cost of trying, this is really what makes all of this difficult. The other thing to bear in mind is that many of us do want to promote a switch towards more sustainable agriculture, but the more that if you think of pure fertilizer that is very capital intensive, most of what you need is getting access to the cash so that you can buy it and apply it everywhere. But the more you think of sustainable practices, not overusing the nutrients, but just the ones that you need and adapting this, the more we're thinking of knowledge intensive technologies, because you need to rotate between crops or intercrop or find different biofertilizers. And most of this require more knowledge than cash. And hence you will get more and more into these kind of knowledge constraints and facing this complexity. What happens then, you have what are the, in this session, we really want to focus on, hence, what are the behavioral insights? What do behavioral economy tell us when facing all these challenges? One, expect that given all these complexity, herding will happen. Herding is kind of looking what others do and following what they do, not because I can't think, but because if I think it's a way of aggregating information, they may do this because they know something that I don't. And it's like, I was just coming out of the airport, and if everyone goes this direction, then I should go this direction because that's probably where the exit is. Someone may know it, but it's not always taking us to the right direction when you do this. And that's how you tend to manage complex decisions. Institutional signals, for example, the simple fact that there is a subsidy, that there is a demo plots for a certain fertilizer, means that in some way the institution is sending us a signal that this is something that is worth trying. So they have to rely on this kind of information as well. And hence you have to be twice more careful about what you want to promote. Do you really have knowledge that tells you that this is the right thing to promote, because you have consequences there? And hence it's really about finding this right balance between how farmers tend to behave in such conditions with and with the information that you can provide them, and the networks and the skills will be really key into this. So let's get back to the input subsidy studies that we've been mentioning, and that I already summarized sort of the big cost benefits that you get out of this in the big picture. And some of the main results that we got out of there, one is that it increased inputs. These are sort of the estimated coefficients in standard deviations. It increased fertilizer on maize, it increased maize yield, and it somehow increased consumption, though more in the short run. So these happen directly during the year of the study. Then, in fact, we can document that it is the learning effect that is partly driving at least some of these, because their expected yield with the technology package did increase. And finally, no, not finally, but the effects was persistent even after the subsidy was over, because this is the effect 2 years after the subsidy was over. And we do see that they continue using more fertilizer, they continue having higher yields, and the effects on consumption really show up, in fact, after the years after it happens. So this is really learning about their behavior and how they tend to react to such a subsidy that promotes their learning. And the second big part of the story is that their neighbors who didn't get it directly, but only observed at least 2 people who got the subsidy, tend to have the same kind of effects. And that happens after, in the 2 years after the subsidy year, right? So there is indeed these kind of stories of learning, of network. And so big question is, how do we design programs that make the best use of these networks, long-term learning effects in face of the challenges that they have? I'm very tight on time, so I think the risk aversion story, I think that basically perhaps the major elements of risk, some of this is related to the risk that you're facing because investing in fertilizer means I'm putting some cash in this and I will get returns only if there are good rainfalls, right? So an innovation can increase risk, but a good part of the risk also comes from I'm trying something that I don't know yet whether it's good or not for me. So the lack of information end up also building more risk and creating more risk from the perspective of the farmer, even though it's not a real risk in some cases because it's actually a better innovation. But if you don't know it, for you, it is a risk. And so we need to think of risk from the perspective of the farmers, given the lack of information that we have. I think that I should perhaps the one that I should skip the most should be this one because the insurance section will have much more on risk and much more settled than even what I would say in this. Uh, now, the financial constraint is also another big one that is both faced and where behaviors are part of this. And so the typical solutions have been on one side, for example, microcredit, but you should, in microcredit is obviously a quick solution for people who don't have cash, but we should remember that it tends to come with pretty high interest rates. And hence, you really have to think of, okay, what's the long-term dynamic if I have 20% interest rates or more, and over the long run, any investment that I have, you will have to take out the 20, 30% benefits that I have first to give it to the bank. And then maybe I have some extra, maybe not. And who have some extra benefits, maybe the highest skills people, but it has shown to be kind of a solution, but not necessarily for everyone. Whereas savings, and perhaps not to make them compete, because again, we'll think in some cases of them are complementary, but savings has other advantages. One is that all businesses need to manage some cash flows with different spendings at different times. And the credit is kind of a one-time big income. But if you don't have ways of managing this cash flow, I think in the fields, we've seen so many times businesses, investments that are being stuck because they don't have cash at the moment. And that is because it's becoming very hard to manage this cash, right? So you know this, but how does this interact with behaviors? And perhaps one of the main things to think about is the amount that the cash availability that you have is actually highly conditional on have you put money forward before, right? It's not that at this moment I appear and now I don't have cash. There is a bit of cash management. And so why savings has these advantages of not costing you interest, it is more demanding in terms of planning, of thinking forward and getting this money. And how and we will want to think of so you could have external interventions. How do we maybe a lockbox, maybe some discount early on, as Andrew Dillon will talk about now in some of the studies, that it's external and it solves the problem that you're maybe not planning enough and looking forward. Or you could have more internal interventions that think, okay, how do we help you solve this kind of constraints? A very well-known example is this tying Odysseus to the math of Dean Carl and Nav Ashraf and their team. And they think of, okay, what if we create commitment savings? So this has the idea that not only people are somewhat over discounting the future, but they are aware of this. So if you ask them ahead of time, they may be willing to say, okay, I want to commit and be enabled to withdraw money for a certain amount of time so that I can reach my goals, my longer term goals. And it has really interesting findings in really making people save more. But there is this kind of ambiguity about, okay, there is some form of paternalism, light touch paternalism, because they agree to this, but then they can't withdraw this. And at what cost this has. So this is the external kind of solutions. Another very famous paper is this nudging farmers to use fertilizer, where if you offer them a discount early on, then you make them think of buying and reserving the money for the fertilizer from early on in the season. And that tends to work as good as a 50% discount that comes much later as the time to buy fertilizer. So we want to think of these as external solutions that could work in some context to solve a specific problem. And Dillon will really dive into this example of, okay, now what happens if you actually vary some of the credit, providing credit with providing such discount, and you really maybe the conclusions tend to be much more subtle in the idea that not everyone procrastinates, not everyone fits into what Duflo and their team has found, and let's have designs that actually tend to adapt to this kind of projects. Let me now think of, I just want to push this. These are the external examples of external solutions. So what do we have in terms of endogenous behavior and personality in order to solve this? Think of behavior. Now we want to throw a bit the idea of behavioral poverty traps, and I think this connects to what Michael was saying. The idea that preferences seem to be exogenous, or we like to, as economists, we like to think of it as exogenous, but life is about setting your preferences, them evolving, and what happens if you have these kind of preferences. And so if you will think of your preferences could affect your skills in the sense that being patient is a skill, but it's also a preference for present versus future, for example. And many of these, and if you have these kind of loop where poverty actually affects your skill level, but on the other side, and for example, being patient, for example, cognitive skills, but on the other side, skills can affect poverty, then you will actually result in different equilibria. An equilibrium of you're poor and with low skill, and another one where you have higher skill and you're less poor. And we will see that there are more and more evidence coming of this kind of loop and this kind of behavioral poverty traps that can exist. And hence, just to sort of conclude, I think on this, you could think of policies that are either external solutions that compensate for this lack of skills, trying to directly change the skills, example, to address the psychological trauma, to raise aspirations, and we'll have more on this coming later in the other sessions. Or you can think of address the poverty and the economic conditions that resulted in the lower skills. And this the input subsidy story is about let's address the economic reasons that created the low aspirations and the low vision for the future, and then that you could create a virtuous cycle if you could actually solve the initial problem. I think I'm good enough for, I'm done for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachid. Andrew, next. So Andrew Dillon is a professor of economics at Northwestern University. Let me just stop sharing and we will get your slides up. Okay. Let me share and then I will. Tuck us back here. Oop. There we go. Okay, how's that?
Great, awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here in person and everybody online. Thanks to MRR for organizing this great event. And thanks to Rachid for setting the table for what's hopefully is an interesting discussion of kind of a deeper dive of, kind of behavioral insights into the way we think about farmers making investments. And so I'm going to talk about some work from Mali, from an experiment we did in rural Mali to try to integrate some behavioral perspectives into the way we design markets, agricultural input markets, to affect the way that farmers might decide about how to invest in fertilizer for the upcoming season. And so that's kind of the context. Let's see, can I change slides now? That's the big thing. Oh, here we go. Okay, success. So, a big kind of common problem that we talk about a lot is that farmers maybe suboptimally use fertilizer relative to kind of nutrient soil gaps that we kind of see, and that the returns to fertilizer may be higher than we actually observe kind of in the field. And so kind of a basic problem in development is to think about, how maybe to address input market integration problems. We know this can cause misallocation and inefficiencies in the agricultural sector. And so in some of the things we've talked about this morning, we've thought about this problem from the perspective of what are the constraints that the farmer has. And we'll integrate some of those insights, but we're also going to take a little bit of a market perspective in thinking about not only what might drive farmer investment behavior, but also what might be insights that we can use that might be complementary also on the supply side in creating these agricultural markets. But to start off from the perspective of the farmer problem and kind of the randomized control trial that we designed to kind of think about these kind of different theories of change, we observed in our baseline data in Mali that 70% of farmers didn't actually interact with an ag input dealer in their village in the previous agricultural season. And this is important when we look at other survey data across other country contexts. In Ghana, for example, in national surveys, we find kind of similar rates of farmers not having access in their villages to agricultural markets or agricultural input dealers. And so this is important because when we think about what we mean by markets, a lot of times we talk about having access to rural roads as being like a proxy for market integration. But there's some good work, Tom Jane and Jordan Chamberlain, for example, have looked at infrastructure access variables and market participation variables, and have found that there is actually really low correlation between these types of variables. So when we talk about what we mean by markets, actually thinking about both time and place when markets are formed and the choices that farmers have in those markets can be very important. When we start to bring in time dimensions, then potential behavioral implications become important, because how people make decisions over different states of time can lead to some differences in their preferences and what they might be able to do now versus what they might want to do later, and the optimality of those types of decisions. So Rachid had mentioned this paper by Duflo, Kramer, and Robinson, which argued that commitment mechanisms and kind of time inconsistent preferences of farmers might be driving some suboptimal investment by farmers in agricultural inputs. So basically, farmers may put off making investments that they know are optimal, and what they would want to do in the planting season isn't maybe what they actually decide to do in the post-harvest season. So in the post-harvest period, farmers have a lot of income. They could make these investment decisions. They would like, when they arrive at the planting season, to actually have fertilizer to put on their fields, but they don't actually make that decision when they have the income in the post-harvest period. And so in some sense, their decision might be suboptimal, right? But we have another set of evidence too about seasonal liquidity. And we know because of this like high income drop that farmers get during the harvest period, that how they smooth that liquidity over time also is kind of complicated. And so in the Duflo, Kramer, Robinson framework, they find that investments in the post-harvest period, by providing farmers with a commitment contract, the ability to purchase fertilizer and be locked into that in the post-harvest period, actually increases their agricultural investment even more so than providing subsidies during the planting season, right? And so this is an important effect, but it's also relates to liquidity. Farmers also have a lot higher liquidity in the post-harvest period. And so which is kind of driving those results? Is it liquidity, or is it really time inconsistent preferences of farmers? And this matters from an investment design and a program design perspective, because providing commitment contracts has a lot different cost implications than providing farmers with liquidity, right? So implicating a microfinance organization or providing directed credit is a lot more expensive, both to farmers and to implementing agencies, than just providing maybe a commitment contract. And we'll also talk about how commitment contracts might actually create markets by providing ag input dealers, who are also small scale business people, more liquidity and more commitment by farmers at an earlier period of time, which may actually create market development in addition to also increasing like farmer investment, right? So if we're thinking about this from the perspective not only of the farmer, but also of the ag input dealer, commitment contracts may increase their liquidity and allow them to stock out the type of fertilizer that they need to deliver during planting season when farmers actually need it. So in this experiment, we're going to think a little bit about what are the effects of market timing, liquidity, and commitment in kind of making input markets, and how we might design markets in different ways and what those effects might be on farmer demand, right? So the basic model, the basic thing we're going to do is to actually create an input fair in rural villages. So we're going to work with real ag input dealers. We invite 3 or 4 ag input dealers to rural villages. They show their products to farmers. So you see a picture here of in the post-harvest period of some fertilizers, some samples of seeds, other agricultural input products, and farmers can make orders for those inputs to be delivered during the planting season. And so you have these supply side actors. We're working with real ag input dealers. They're making private sector decisions. They're offering prices. So we're not telling ag input dealers how to act in these kind of markets. And we're leaving farmers also to make their own decisions. We're integrating also into some of these models a microfinance institution, which is offering market rate loans to farmers that they deem to be good credit risks. So there's an offer of credit in some of these village input fairs. And so our basic experimental design is you can think about like organizing these markets in several different ways, some of which have kind of behavioral implications because of kind of the commitment contracts that you could think about farmers agreeing to with an ag input dealer. So if you see, does my clicker, let's see if my clicker works here. Yeah. So if you see here in this experimental design, we can kind of play around with thinking about how these markets are organized by whether the commitment is a harder or softer commitment. And by hard or soft commitment, we mean the amount that the farmer has to put up in the post-harvest period to secure their order, right? And so in the Duflo, Kramer, Robinson paper, they actually looked at 100%. The farmers had to pay everything in advance. Here we're looking at a 10%, which we call kind of a soft commitment by the farmer. And in group 2, we're looking at a 50% upfront payment by the farmer, which is a harder commitment in some sense. And this actually matters not only for the farmer's decision, but it's going to matter a lot to the ag input dealer, because the ag input dealer would obviously prefer to have more money up front, right? But if it reduces demand so much that it might affect their margins, then maybe they would actually be okay with a 10% commitment credit, a commitment contract, as opposed to like a 50% commitment contract. So here we're going to look at in a group of each group has about 20 villages assigned, randomly assigned. So here we're going to organize markets. Ag input dealers are going to take 10% upfront, and then they'll deliver inputs during the planting season, right? So here we're playing with commitment and timing of the markets. In group 2, we're going to look at a harder commitment, which is this 50% upfront payment. In groups 3 and 4, we're going to do the same thing with respect to commitments, 10 and 50% in groups 3 and 4. But now in those groups also, we're going to invite microfinance organizations to offer credit to farmers that they deem to be good risks. So they're going to act as they would in the market. We don't force anyone to make loans or take credit or anything like that. But here they have the option farmer has the option of either self-financing or also taking credit. And so here in groups 3 and 4, we're playing with commitment, we're playing with liquidity, and we're playing with market timing at the same time of where we've organized these. And then in group 5 and 6, we organizing spot markets during the planting season. So here the market timing is different than the earlier input fairs that are organized in the post-harvest period. We're offering credit in group 5. And in group 6, we're just kind of ensuring market access. We're not offering credit at all, and we have kind of a control group. So this is the way we can kind of integrate into a randomized control trial some of these behavioral insights to kind of disentangle potentially different theories of change that might explain how input market behavior might differ between farmers and might have different benefits for ag input dealers and actually kind of creating these markets. Okay. So here's what we find. I'll just summarize a few of our kind of high-level results. And I think one of the interesting things that we find is that both kind of credit and commitment contract treatments have a statistically effect on farmer fertilizer demand. So in these first 5 groups, we find a statistically significant effect on total fertilizer demand relative to our control group. But what we don't find, which is also interesting, is that there's no statistically different effect between just providing farmers with market access relative to a counterfactual control group, right? So just providing people market access isn't kind of creating markets or isn't creating demand, difference in demand for fertilizer. So this is really important because a lot of times in kind of integrating into programs, We want to have some sort of market access component. And so what we're finding, at least in this context in Mali, is that both credit and liquidity are important components of actually increasing farmer demand, not just simply having access to the market itself. Okay. So in kind of disentangling a little bit more the theories of change, we actually find that liquidity and commitment are actually substitutes. So we find kind of statistically significant effects of our commitment mechanisms. This increases farmer demand by about 3 bags of fertilizer, oh, sorry. Okay. So this increases farmer fertilizer by about 3 bags of fertilizer. And we actually find kind of a similar effect, which is not statistically different if we just offer credit during the planting season, right? So if we think about kind of whether commitment is driving more farmer fertilizer demand than kind of input market formation or liquidity, we find kind of statistically similar effects between these two treatments. When we add credit, when we add liquidity with commitment contracts, we do see kind of an increase in demand, but we can't differentiate these effects between the kind of commitment contracts. And so kind of what's interesting is to think about from an investment design perspective, like what are the components which might make markets kind of most efficiently at a most cost-effective way. To organize village input fairs, our marginal cost is $100 per fair, right? So it's a pretty cheap kind of intervention. Integrating credit into those fairs, it would obviously be more costly than just kind of providing nudges. And so thinking about how to organize the investment and exploit timing variation to reduce costs can be kind of an interesting insight into thinking about kind of the investment design problem. Okay. So the last thing to look at in this data is like related to participation and how people perceive the behavioral intervention. So here we actually find lower participation rates when we organize markets earlier in the post-harvest season. Some of these effects may be because like the innovation is a little bit novel. It's not the normal way that people purchase fertilizers. So people may be a little bit hesitant because it's kind of the first season we introduced it. But we also did kind of some qualitative work and especially with this 50% commitment and credit option, we found a lot of village leaders simply refusing to allow those markets to be organized. And basically they thought that the risk of providing 50% upfront and also potentially taking credit was like too risky for the farmers in their village. So there was kind of some systematic refusal of that type of market organization, right? But among the farmers who did take up, even though these rates are slightly different between the planting season and the post-harvest season, we saw order values were much higher in the post-harvest season, which explains kind of our treatment effects, right? So people did take advantage of the commitment contracts and this earlier market timing to actually order more fertilizer relative to kind of a counterfactual group. Farmers in general like trusted these interventions quite a bit, with the exception of this 50% commitment credit too. So in terms of like facilitating market trust and confidence in the interaction, trust was relatively high in kind of offering these types of innovations. How am I doing on time? Oh, I guess I'm on my final slide, but hold it up. Okay. So just kind of a few kind of general thoughts on like integrating behavioral insights into randomized control trials and like investment designs and how to create kind of a learning agenda. I think one of the things, both from a program design perspective, but also in creating evidence to kind of support different program models, it's really important to kind of keep in mind that not all farmers are the same. So in like the Duflo-Kramer-Robinson paper, when they actually tried to measure farmer preferences, time inconsistent preferences, which would be consistent with farmers finding those types of contracts really attractive to them, they only find that about 45% of farmers actually have time inconsistent preferences. So in our work too, we find a lot of heterogeneity in farmers in terms of what their time preferences might be, which will certainly affect the design of different programs and different investments. So farmers are different along lots of different dimensions. So we can't just think that, you know, behavioral insights are going to solve all of our problems, as kind of other people have mentioned. The other thing that's really important when we think about theories of change is that ideally we want to be able to measure the types of things that are driving farmer behavior, right? And measuring time preferences can be complicated, especially in a lot of the contexts in which we work. So I think encouraging measurement experiments and also piloting, if you're going to integrate behavioral insights into your program models, is a really useful thing to do. And I mentioned a little bit the cost implications. There's lots of theories of change that could drive this type of behavior. So thinking not only about how a program model is going to affect demand, but also the cost implications of different behavioral models can be really useful. And that's where some of these a lot of optimism about behavioral models comes from, right? Is because they're relatively less costly to kind of integrate into program models than other types of theories of change, which may be more expensive to kind of mobilize. So we're actually in the process of scaling up these village input fairs based on kind of some of these results. The ag input dealers were very interested in the 10% commitment contracts with credit because they thought it increased average transaction values the most among the different perspectives or the different treatments. And so now some of the things we've tried to think about as we've addressed scaling also have behavioral dimensions. So for example, we're thinking about creating auctions to actually sell ag input dealers licenses to be the ag input dealers in these different fairs. And so there's lots of kind of competitive behavior or behavioral implications in the way ag input dealers may bid. And if we're thinking about a private sector model where selling auctions is going to cover the marginal cost of organizing these fairs, how we design the auction is actually important to kind of generating the revenue that drives this scaling strategy. So thinking about some of that in kind of auction design can be important. And I would just mention that I think there's behavioral implications not only from this private sector strategy approach, but also we have some good examples in the public sector sphere in the way, especially we designed teacher contracts in Rwanda, for example, that might affect people's behavioral intrinsic motivation to apply for jobs or to provide effort on the job. So we can think about, especially as we scale up and we think about how we're going to actually contract to incentivize the type of behaviors we'd like to scale up, what the behavioral implications are, especially from a contracting perspective. So that's, I think, another area to consider as you design your investments and design programs. Right? So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
So there was a lot to process. Are there any kind of immediate questions right now that are just they're burning questions for Andrew before we move on? No, okay, so we will have a Q&A kind of time at the end. So if something does percolate, let us know. Okay. Yeah. All right. So now we are going to have Lauren join us. Lauren, if you're there, if you want to...
Can you allow me to share screen?
Sorry? Hold on, let me just make you a... Why is it not letting me do that? Okay. Did you? Okay, as a co-host? Okay, great. Thank you.
Ah, perfect. Okay.
Are you in there, Lauren?
Yes, now I think I am. Can you all see that?
Yeah, so hold on. Let me make sure that we can see this nicely as well. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Oh, also, I'm not allowed to share my video, so that's fine by me, but that's why you're not seeing me right now, just so you know.
Okay, all right, Lauren, thanks so much. And then is everyone online able to hear Lauren well? Okay, great.
Okay, so sorry for not being on video. And also sorry for not being present today, but I have some teaching obligations in New Haven. But thanks for including me. I think this is such an important session. And the work that I'll present today is really on sort of a suite of projects from Kenya that highlight some of these kind of interaction of various constraints, in our case, credit and savings, and also sort of, I think, play on this theme that Rachid was mentioning, where behavioral components can sort of suffuse their way through other constraints. Okay, so the backdrop for this set of projects, which we conducted in Kenya, but really is based on kind of a theme that you see in many staple commodities in low-income country contexts, is the fact that there tend to be pretty large seasonal price fluctuations for staple commodities. So what I'm showing you here is the price for maize across major markets across East Africa. And what you see here is a very common pattern. I'm showing you in blue the harvest time in each of these locations. And what you see is that right at harvest, prices tend to plummet. That's sort of when all the sales happen, supply floods the market. And then prices tend to go back up as supply dries up and goes into, what's called the lean season. These fluctuations are large. They're about, you can see, sort of 20 to 40% in major markets. They're much larger than you see, for example, in U.S. markets that tend to be about a 5% price fluctuation. And they're actually even larger in sort of rural areas like our study site here in Western Kenya. So, one sort of puzzle that emerges is, maize is storable. And so you might imagine that households should use storability to either buy maize in this context at a low price if they're consuming, and or use storage to sell at a high price when prices are high. But in fact, it looks like farmers are, for the most part, doing the exact opposite, which is they are selling at harvest time when prices are low, and buying, often returning to the market to buy back at a high price later on in the season. So this is some work from our pilot survey. We did lots of sort of pilot work for this project, both surveys and focus groups. And what I'm showing you here in this figure is inventories in the weeks post-harvest. And what you see is mean and median inventory. So for the median household, they tend to sell off their maize fairly rapidly post-harvest. And by about 20 weeks post-harvest, they've run out of their own inventories. And that's when they return to the market to buy. So if you look at their net sales, by which I mean the quantity sold minus purchased, you see they're sort of selling in this post-harvest period. That's when prices are low. And they're often buying back in the lean season when prices are high. And this matters. So in terms of magnitude, the median household in our sample is giving up about 1 to 2 months of agricultural wages by selling low and buying high instead of the reverse. So this presents a bit of a puzzle. Why are farmers not using storage to arbitrage these large price fluctuations? As I mentioned, we did a lot of focus groups as well as quantitative data collection. And there's many possible stories that do come up, but sort of the most common one that's mentioned from farmers in these focus groups is simply credit constraints. So there are a lot of bills that come due around harvest time. And in our context in Kenya, school fees are due just a few months after harvest. And the idea is that in the absence of sort of well-functioning financial markets, the timing of expenditure and sales have to go together. And so these high harvest time expenditure needs for school fees and other bills that come due have to be funded with high harvest time sales. So we partnered with a large NGO that many of you may know, 1 Acre Fund, to randomly offer a harvest time loan to smallholder farmers worth about $100. We also, I won't have time to discuss today, but I might mention at the end, we also randomized the fraction of farmers that we offer this loan to in a given community. That allows us to ask questions at a market level of, for example, what happens when many farmers take on this loan and potentially engage in storage? What does that do to these price fluctuations at a market level? Do we see smoother prices over time as farmers are arbitraging? Okay, so it's kind of the classic. Maybe I would classify it as kind of the hard constraint, the credit constraint. One really interesting thing that came up in these focus groups when we spoke to households about storage and about the possibility of offering these loans, households expressed they might have a hard time managing and reinvesting the returns from the loan, okay, as well as sort of the loan itself. Several sort of sub-stories we're mentioning here as to why there might be a hard time kind of managing the flow of funds. Lack of access to safe savings was a big one, of course. But other stories came up. So I saw one conversation happening in the chat just now about this idea that, we as economists love to call it kin tax, which is that potentially when you have, say, more revenues or more storage, that more maize and storage, that your kin might potentially, neighbors, friends, et cetera, who are in need might potentially ask you to share. Then that's what we call sort of the kin tax. There's also mental accounting. How do we think about sort of shifting around payments across time and earmarking them for certain purposes? So we heard these, several stories come up, and so we decided to cross-randomize the loan with really sort of a simple savings technology. And this is where I want to emphasize how simple this is. This is where I think part of the behavioral component comes in. This technology was a lockbox. It was a very simple, inspired by some of the literature actually in the same context in Kenya by Pascaline Dupont and John Robinson, that offering very simple savings technologies. This lockbox is just a metal box that you keep in your house with a key that you have access to yourself. That this lockbox can potentially alleviate many of these constraints I just mentioned. So it provides a safe place to save. It potentially, protects cash both from others and from yourself in some ways by allowing you to keep it in a safe location, have it earmarked for whatever purpose you might want it for. So I really viewed this combination of these two interventions both as speaking to interactions between credits and savings constraints, but also really thinking about sort of combining hard, unlocking or relaxing hard constraints with soft constraints, right? This lockbox is very simple, very cheap. You can think of this like sort of a behavioral nudge to save. And so I want to ask, does layering on this simple lockbox, does that sort of unlock greater gains from some of these credit interventions? So this is just a simple figure to show you how we designed this intervention. Again, I'm cutting out some details. We ran it across 2 years and re-randomized in between to give us an internal replication exercise. But the overall sort of design is very simple. We took our sample, randomly divided the sample into farmer groups that were offered this harvest time loan and ones that were not. And at an individual level, we randomized, do we give them this simple metal lockbox or not? Okay, let me first just show you the impact of the loan by itself and try to highlight some of both the successes and also limitations of just the loan by itself. So what I'm showing here is just comparing loan to non-loan farmers, not thinking yet about the lockbox. So the loan was very successful in encouraging storage and increasing revenues. Okay, so what we see here is basically the difference between the treatment and control group over time. So in this context, November is sort of the immediate post-harvest period, and June, July, August are into the lean season. And what I'm showing you is the difference in inventories, the bags of maize that are held within a household between the treatment control group for the loan. And so you see as the loan sort of works, right? So we see increased inventories, they're holding inventories for longer. Of course, as the season goes on and you go into the lean season, the difference starts diminishing as treated households are selling off their inventories during this period of lean season higher prices as we'd expect. As a result, for net revenues, we see actually initially lower net revenues in the treated group. That comes from holding off selling that maize. In fact, a small fraction, about 5% of households actually were very entrepreneurial and went out and purchased maize. But most of this is holding off selling, okay? So net revenues actually go down at first, but they go up, of course, in the lean season when that maize is released to the market and at higher prices. And I'll show you in a moment, when you add all this up, this is a significantly, this is a positive effect on net revenues and significantly so. Okay, so that's kind of the success of the loan. Where things are a little more disappointing is when you turn to both consumption and sort of reinvestment of this net revenues, okay? So in total consumption, we see, fairly similar patterns to net revenues, but much smaller and weaker. I want to now show you these results in regression form and show you also some investments. So as promised before, this is just the pooling across the entire year. What is the total effect on net revenues? You see significantly higher revenues. So again, it worked in that dimension. Total consumption is, a little higher, perhaps marginally significantly so, okay, but not massive. And we don't see that households are sort of reinvesting these profits into farming investments, by which I mean, what did they spend on fertilizer, seeds, labor, et cetera. And we don't see any change in sort of forward-looking educational investments in things like school fees. What happens when we layer on the lockbox? Okay, there we don't see a big change in net revenue, so it didn't seem to affect their storage behavior very much or their revenues. Okay? But now we do see increases both in overall consumption as well as sort of the reinvestment of, either the profits from the loan or the loan itself into farming investment and potentially school fees. This is not quite significant, but is sort of borderline. Okay? So it looks like offering this lockbox, this very simple sort of nudge, really enabled farmers to take this loan product and make the most of it, both to have higher consumption and to reinvest it in the future in terms of farm investment and school fees. I'll say because that 2x2 design, we can also test things like, was it the lockbox alone that did this? No, in the lockbox only group, we don't see these gains. It really comes from the interaction here that I'm showing you. Okay. So I'm going to say a few moments on mechanisms. I think this is where it sort of relates to some of these behavioral components, although I do want to be transparent that, these are sort of just suggestive results. So there's a couple mechanisms that we think here at play. One is that the lockbox is enabling households to move funds intertemporally. Okay? So what I'm showing you here on the left graph, this solid line is showing you household consumption for that loan plus lockbox group, that group for which we unlocked sort of both the credit and savings constraints. And the short dash line is the loan only group. Okay? And so what you see is, first just much smoother consumption over time in the group that got both, especially here in the lean season, right? We're not seeing the big dip that you see in the other group. Okay? And so it's allowing the movement of funds intertemporally. That could be for a couple of reasons. The first is having just a safe place to save, right? So, many of these households, very few of them have access to formal savings accounts. Holding money in cash, of course, can present safety concerns. And so the lockbox is simply potentially a safer place to save. Right? This could have also happened, though, because of mental accounting, right? So we've now basically allowed households to have a particular place where they're storing money. They sort of know it's there. They can assign it for a particular use. And that can also help households overcome behavioral constraints to moving funds intertemporally. And I'll just note here, this orange line is showing you sort of the dis savings from the lockbox. So we see indeed that's part of what is contributing to the smoothing out of consumption, especially in the lean season. They're really drawing down what they have in the lockbox. Okay? But the second thing to note is that we're seeing not just smoother consumption over time, but also a level shift. So it's not just smoother coming from a reduction in consumption in this post-harvest period and higher consumption in the lean season. We're actually seeing higher consumption across the board. And that's really this, you can see it here on the left-hand side, but this right-hand side graph shows that a little more clearly. And so it also just means higher consumption overall. Again, here, the evidence is merely suggestive. We think this is consistent potentially with the story around, again, some of the comments that were made in the chat just now about this idea of a kin tax, right? So this lockbox may also allow people to sort of protect their savings from being highly taxed by kin. We see some other evidence that's suggestive or consistent with the story. For example, we see that households that are highly taxed by their kin at baseline are taxed less when they have access to the lockbox. I do want to say that this terminology of tax makes this idea seem quite negative, but I do want to be transparent. I think there's real ambiguity here as to kind of the social impacts of this idea of a kin tax. On one hand, some of the evidence suggests, for example, this other paper in Kenya as well by Pam Jekyll and Owen Osier, that this kin tax might discourage investment that's consistent with what we see, which is these households are able to reinvest in education for their families, farming incomes, et cetera. On the other hand, you could also call this not a tax, but kind of social insurance, right? And that allows households to insure each other during times of shock. So I just want to be transparent. I think the welfare implications there are not totally clear. So let me just conclude, and I'm really eager to get into the discussion part of our conversation. I think there's a couple of things that are highlighted here. I'll mention two on the slides, and then if you'll permit me, just add one more at the end related to what Andrew presented. So the first is this very simple idea of just, we might have to relax multiple constraints at once. So, this paper shows, I think, both the promise of credit. We see there's really big increases in revenues, but we don't see, for example, sort of sustained consumption gains or future reinvestment. we might need to layer on additional interventions to address, say, savings constraints to allow households to channel, increased revenues or cash into future investment. In particular, I want to note sort of the power in combining what I want to call kind of hard constraints with sort of softer or more behavioral constraints. So here I think of kind of the hard constraint as being the credit. And the soft constraint is being the sort of behavioral nudge through the lockbox. Here relaxing things like mental accounting constraints or kin tax, et cetera. We see this not just in agriculture, I want to say, but we see it in other settings as well. I mean, very disparate settings. So for example, there's this Banerjee et al. Piece looking at vaccination clinics in India, showing that when you give, when you provide basically vaccination clinics that provide additional access to local provision of vaccines, that can increase vaccine adoption among children in India. But when you layer on a very simple behavioral nudge, in their case, a very small, cheap bag of lentils to encourage households to attend these camps, that can really increase the benefits. So, in some way, I view these behavioral nudges as sort of turbochargers. It may be that on their own, our case in the lockbox on its own didn't do much, but when you layer that on top of relaxing a hard constraint, that can really kind of turbocharge your intervention. The last thing I want to mention, we can discuss this more in the panel if that makes sense, is just thinking about kind of how some of these results fit together. So one of the interesting implications of the idea that farmers are time inconsistent is, okay, well maybe we should essentially move the timing of when they make planting and investment decisions closer to harvest, because that's when they have cash on hand, right? And if they're time inconsistent, if they're having a hard time saving up, it'd be better to make the payment happen at the time they have cash on hand. But I want to know the time they have cash on hand is also endogenous, is also a choice, right? Storage would enable them potentially to move the timing of when they have cash on hand. And just to think through these implications, for example, Malawi, at some point, there's a really nice paper by Brian Dillon showing that when Malawi changed the timing of its school fees to be closer to harvest, very much with this idea of basically asking households to pay for school at the time they have cash on hand, that actually encourage greater sales at harvest time, as I just showed, and I'm sure you all know, that's when prices are lowest. And this can have even kind of general equilibrium effects of, if everyone does that at once, that can further lower prices and make this issue even harder. So I really appreciated the comments that Rachid made of thinking about sort of when cash is available as itself is not fixed, it itself is endogenous, itself is a decision. And I think behavioral features sort of ripple through all of these. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to discussing during the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Lauren. Okay, you want to go back to your slides from before? Okay. Yep, let's on. Okay. We'll share screen again. Oops. Nope.
Hello, me again. Now to try to wrap up a little bit this discussion. Now I think there was a not sure how much time I have, because we definitely want to leave time for discussions. So now I will tell you a little bit more about this story about endogenous behavioral traits. And I think behind all these stories, there is a challenge about farmers' behavior, which we know is completely normal and is even provoked by the situation. We know that we are all possibly discounting the future too much, and the idea is that the situation, the poverty, could actually make it even worse in some cases for many of the behavioral traits that we may have. And hence, what can we do about it? So I was kind of getting ahead of myself and already starting this session in my last presentation. Yeah, but the idea is that you can, especially I want now to emphasize the possibility of poverty traps, where you have this vicious cycle that I was describing between poverty, which lowers some of your skills, which in turn generates more poverty. And hence, we can think of external solutions directly addressing the skills or addressing the economic situation. These are three types of intervention that could actually help you deal with this kind of behavioral poverty traps. So let's take one concrete example. The paper of Manny and others generated a lot of attention because it showed that poverty could impede cognitive function. Basically, precisely playing with this harvest timing. For example, there are some times of the year when farmers have more money than others. There is even more research that kind of use some variations of timing. For example, people before they receive their paycheck or after they receive their paycheck, or you can induce some stress by asking them questions about their income and how they manage money. And basically, you typically find one thing is that people that are poorer tend to have a reduction in their cognitive bandwidth. And that means less cognitive ability, but not because you're less smart, but basically because your cognitive ability is already overwhelmed by this stress of managing money issues, and hence you have even less cognitive bandwidth that is dedicated to make decisions, leading to wrong decisions or less good decisions, and that in turn could increase poverty. So you have a vicious cycle that has been documented this way. Now, in the work that we've had in Mozambique, and again, this is really fed by, I spent about 2 years of my PhD time living in Mozambique in rural area in Chimoio, and there was really a sort of getting embedded is this culture and the way people think, and it seemed to be really a fundamental concept and constraint for lots of people. And it really resonates with a lot of the psychology literature, with a few concepts at least. You could think of one thing is there is what we call utility from anticipation. And the idea is that you have, the more you have, you expect bad things to happen, you will create an immediate disutility even before it happens. So for a given level of consumption, I feel very different if I know that tomorrow I'm going to a wedding or I'm going to a funeral tomorrow. And there's this anticipation effect even before it happens. And you combine this with some form of cognitive dissonance, and perhaps the sour grape story, which in fact is a fable de La Fontaine, which I know because I like to read this to my daughter, to my 2-year-old daughter. And there is this story of the fox that cannot reach the grapes and concludes that they must be sour because I cannot reach this. And this is cognitive dissonance in some way. You change your preferences in a way that serves you, and especially to preserve the ego. And there is this story that if I'm not able to feed my future self and family, then I may as well tell myself that I don't care about the future. And this is a real process, and cognitive dissonance is particularly interesting because in psychology, it's one of the processes through which preferences tend to be changed, to be modified in a way that serves you but is not conscious. It kind of serves you to avoid this distress, but on the other side, it penalizes you economically in the long run. So the conclusion is that basically, if you know that you will be poor, then you care even less about the future. And as a conclusion, will create this vicious cycle between poverty and having a shorter time horizon, which in turn affects your poverty. And again, beyond my own field work, there is a lot of documentation of, here are some quotes about this: mental health problems, stress, anxiety, depression, lack of self-esteem, and suicide are among the more commonly identified effects of poverty and ill-being by discussion groups. So it's clear, all this stress around poverty is a real thing that people mention a lot. And so it has to affect their lives in some way. And even closer to the story of this paper, one of the quotes was, these agonizing decisions take their toll. People cope by focusing on one day at a time, becoming indifferent, apathetic, or hovering near losing their mind. And maybe it sounds exaggerated, but it actually does harm your mental abilities. And so what are the consequences of these things when it happens? And so as in economics, we kind of think of the rational, and I told you that my presentation would be very high-tech, so here is the main animation of the story. The difference between a the exponential time preference kind of have a rational discount because the ratio from one time A to B and from B to C should always be the same, should be, so it leads necessarily to an exponential time preference, whereas present bias is some kind of preference that depends on where you are. So the kind of commitment stories is someone that knows that depending on where I am in time, I will heavily discount the future. So maybe if you ask people at time A to take a decision about how you will allocate money between B and C, then they're more rational at time A, right? But this present bias discounting is the part that could be most affected by this psychological effects, because here it's really, I don't want to think about the future. That depends on when I am at a given moment. So now let's talk about the main results, and this is connected to the same Mozambique study about input subsidy, but also to a different interventions that was about creating savings account with some financial education to open savings account and a match savings in particular. Think of a 50, it's sort of a subsidy for savings. You get a 50% match on your savings up to a certain amount in order to create the habit of saving. And so both especially the voucher, the input subsidy, the voucher for input subsidy, and the match savings are, you could think of these are as interventions that think, okay, if you want to break this cycle, you could try to put videos to have people more forward looking, for example, as the kind of discussions that will be discussed. But on the other side, you could also think if you reduce the poverty, then you could also create a virtuous cycle. Right. And so you have a bit of a multiplier, a behavioral multiplier through the change in behavior that this creates. And this could really emphasize the effects. And we do, so the results, to summarize them, are that indeed, we do see that farmers do increase their time horizon when they benefited either from the input subsidies or from the match savings. What is perhaps surprising is that the financial education in itself didn't seem to have any effect on time horizon, despite this trying to affect this. And perhaps here there is some caution about, in some cases, we want to directly address the behavioral constraint, but if this is a psychological reaction to poverty, well, just telling me you should think more about the future is not helping much, because I have very psychological strong reasons behind that saves my mental health by not thinking about this future. So another way is, if I help you with the future and help you put money forward, then now we can trigger and bring some solutions to this kind of problem. And another nice thing of the paper is that we do see that those who change their behavior, those who become more forward-looking, then are actually those who end up investing more and increasing their input use, etc. So this is now one part of the research shows that indeed, if you reduce the poverty, you improve time horizon. And the second part of the research says if you increase your time horizon, this is, again, like Lauren, this is the part that is less causal and it's a bit more descriptive. But those that do increase their time horizon are indeed those that seem to have better investments, more investments in what we know has been quite profitable investments. So indeed, so we kind of show both arrows in this poverty, in this cycle, and so evidence that you could actually break the poverty cycle. This is it. Now we are happy to have some questions and time for everyone. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you, Rachid. Okay, so we have, let's see, we have about 15 minutes or so to take questions from the audience here. And we also have questions that we'd like to ask from folks online. They have been listening patiently as well for their chance to interact. Catherine, do you want to ask a few questions? We can kind of bop back and forth.
People in the room to use this opportunity to jump in. You can ask any of the three presenters. So Andrew, Lauren online, or Rachid. So yeah, let's start with John here.
And again, the speakers who are the questions being addressed to repeat the question. Maybe if you guys want to come up.
That's fine, but I want to talk to you.
John, well, so the best speaker for the folks online is actually from the computer. Whoop, whoop. So I think maybe, yeah. Okay. Just kind of.
If you're going to speak, go.
What are the questions?
And I have another one here. Okay, so are we okay on Zoom for, yeah, okay, great.
Yeah, thanks to all the presenters. Sort of a question for Lauren. You know, I had a bit of relevant field experience in what you were describing. And in the place I was working, there was a rather devious scheme put in place by government to limit returns to farmers at the time of harvest. And you know, you think about what's the incentive for that, and that's to keep food prices low in urban centers and with the, you know, the political benefits and those sorts of things. So if ultimately, you know, the proposals that might come from the research would need to be adopted by local authorities and local systems, is there another kind of aspect to this that maybe wasn't explored about, you know, local market actors and policy makers and what their incentives are?
Yeah, it's a great, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Lauren. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I wish I were there and could hear more over lunch about the specifics of the context in which you were working and what this scheming program was. But absolutely, I think that the, you know, the local policymaking context really matters. So let me give you, you know, perhaps a different take on things, but I'd be curious to hear more about your experience. So in Kenya, where we're working, the National Cereals and Produce Board has sort of a mandate to do storage themselves with a goal of stabilizing prices. And they've even at times tried to do sort of a warehouse receipt program where actually farmers could come store there. They could be linked to local banks, et cetera. And they could actually get cash that way. That system has not taken off in that context for a bunch of reasons that I think do have to do with kind of local policymaking. At various times, the NCPB has had some, you know, some mismanagement, had some corruption scandals. The storage facilities have not been great. It takes fixed costs for farmers to get to those facilities that are often located in major towns, and home storage can be better on that front. So it definitely, there are issues around kind of the bank and the bank's not getting out cash in time. And here timing is so critical to get cash into farmers' hands at harvest time. So yes, I think that making this, you know, the benefits of this, of the particular modality here of giving very small loans to farmers for at-home storage can in some ways, like the positive take is this can sidestep some of those issues around kind of, if there are kind of limited government capacity to do this at scale through national sort of storage warehouses. I think this is potentially a more decentralized way of still encouraging greater storage. And I should say, when we give this loan to many farmers in a given area, you do actually see smoother prices over the season. So this does achieve some of the same policy goals. On the other hand, of course, you know, home storage has its own limitations. I think post-harvest losses weren't, in our data, a big issue, but they can be in certain years. You might think, in theory, at least, kind of mass storage could, you know, with economies of scale, provide better technology, et cetera. So I think the limits of kind of government policymaking here are definitely, you know, potentially relevant constraint.
Yeah, do you want to ask it from? All right.
So apparently it's harder for people online to hear on that one. Yes. I don't know. Okay, so this is for both of you. This is a question also from our REGO office, our Resilience Economic Growth Office in Accra in Ghana. It's related to gender. I haven't seen a lot of discussion around gender, women's access to land, both in legal right to own and inherit, and then their ability to make decisions on inputs will be different from men's in most of the countries where we work. She'd like to hear from both of you, if you don't mind. There are social constraints beyond cost that face women, and I think that those ought to be mentioned. Plus, gender-based violence will affect women's aspirations, mental health, etc. So their decision-making agency will also be reduced. We're talking about savings, but if your husband just takes your savings, why would you work harder? Most of our interventions require additional effort and time by the farmer in addition to cost. Time poverty is a big constraint for women. In a lot of the countries where we work, our resilience-focused countries are well, they're the Horn, they're Southern Africa, they're the Sahel. So some of these contexts, and we're trying to help some of the most climate vulnerable.
So thanks a lot for the question. I think gender is particularly relevant when we think about how markets are organized, because if villages aren't, if people don't have access to input markets in their villages, we know that women have higher constraints to traveling outside of the village than men. So one of the mechanisms we think, or one of the theories of change we think is kind of really working in organizing villages in markets is through a gender channel. And so having access to credit relieves liquidity constraints for women. If women have higher liquidity constraints than men, then this is one kind of mechanism to encourage take up. But also in thinking about the place and where the markets are organized, I think that can be something that really reinforces access to markets when women naturally don't have as high access. So that's how I see gender interacting with some of our work.
Hi. No, the only problem is that we'll need an entire day for just these problem of gender, but it definitely interacts with all both the external and internal constraints. For example, any kind of discrimination tends to accentuate these constraints. And one of the examples that was really interesting, but in the education sector, but you took kids in India, and if you just ask them to fill their castes before they do the exam, then those that are from lower caste tended to have much lower score because you kind of remind them that they should be less able, and this consciously or more unconsciously, in fact, reduces how well they're performing. And hence there is a lot of this of telling women that they have a certain role in society, and on top of all the obstacles that they have on top of this, then they have some of these issues. And you have some Bruce Wider and Travis have some of this work where they actually have sort of videos, and on top of a program, they actually have videos and communication that tells women that they can have more agency. And in fact, this has been quite successful in helping them being more entrepreneurial. And with the idea that you also have to address the external kind of constraints together with the internal ones about what you're trying to put on the society. In some cases, you can put it in their heads in terms of the constraints of the things that they can or cannot do. And so there are plenty of intervention and room for improvement that would definitely come from applying this to gender issues as well, definitely.
Anybody else on the room? In the back, I love it. Just
Hi, this is a question for Andrew. So we've talked a lot about cost today and like impact per dollar, and also about information asymmetries. And so I want to ask about first, what were the outcomes in terms of farm level production? There's some difficulty in measuring that, of course, but if there was anything that was measurable, what was there? And then also, Rachid spoke earlier about how well, before we know how well the fertilizer actually increases production, then maybe we won't commit to buying much of it, right? So like a test plot or whatnot. And I'm wondering if you have more longer term data where you can see that the difference between fertilizer purchases between control villages and treatment villages expands over time as that information asymmetry lessens.
So thanks for the question. It's a little unfair because Tyler actually worked at the Global Poverty Research Lab for a little while on this project. So part of the anything that's good on the results is partially attributable to Tyler and our field teams. I think it's interesting to think about like what are the secondary effects of creating markets. And so I'll speak to a couple things. So we look at crop portfolio choice among farmers. We don't see any change in crop portfolio choice by farmers having access to these markets. So seed was something that farmers could have purchased in these markets in addition to fertilizer, but we don't see a lot of change in seed demand in response to having access to these markets, even though ag input dealers provided access to seed. And we think that's partially because a lot of seed, especially in these West African villages, is traded more locally rather than kind of purchased. But we do see shifts in the labor margins. So we do see, especially in the earlier input fares with the commitment contracts, people investing more in hired labor. And we think part of the way that these commitment contracts are working is that farmers are assured of having delivery of fertilizer at planting season, which is a big uncertainty for them. And these commitment contracts resolve that problem. And so they're able to make other types of kind of complementary investments by having some certainty on the input market side. So we do see some changes on other margins, not on seed, but on labor. We do see some changes.
Yeah. So just on the let me first get back to the gender issue, because I had one additional comment. In Colombia, in the project that we're working on with IFAD, they also have some sort of mandatory participation of women, a certain percentage of women that should be part of the projects. And what we found from the qualitative work is that people do mention a lot that, in fact, forcing people to include women and participate in the project has been very beneficial, because the men tended to realize that actually women were much better at managing the money in the joint project. And hence, it's really the idea that there is a huge potential, and any of these discriminations is actually tapping a potential. So not only is it unfair, but it is also completely inefficient. And there's plenty of evidence that shows this. And hence, how rules can create changes in behavior, which in turn can create some kind of multiplier, is really an interesting thing from which we can apply it and keep learning about this. And then the story about the fertilizer learning. So one of the strengths of this work is that we have 5 seasons. So we do have a fair amount of dynamics. We wish we had even more, because part of the story is that they haven't finished learning even after 5 seasons. But one of the puzzles that we had is not only that the profits were initially negative, but the investments keep increasing as they're getting. It's not that the profits are negative, sorry. The effect on profits is negative, so they were reduced compared to the profits that they had. Hence, why would you keep adopting and increase adoption over time as you're seeing a reduction in your profits? And part of this puzzle is really because they realize that there is a learning curve, and why they're going through this learning curve, it will cost them, but some of them seem to persist, and adoption keeps increasing season by season over the 5 seasons. Sort of a story with the smartest, the higher skilled farmers taking the lead, and the lower skilled farmers following what they're doing over time. So we find this fascinating, but also, given all the challenges that they face, it's really a nice story of them being much more persistent and forward-looking than what we portray sometimes in other description and other works that we find. So just to get this kind of nuanced story out of this, really nice.
This question was sharing of you. I'm wondering if cost is a constraint, right, across all the testing you've done. I'm curious to find out if you have considered models where you incentivize savings in order to achieve, for example, if farmers are able to purchase 2 bags of fertilizers and you give them 2 additional bags of food because they're able to save to purchase 2 bags, what are the results over time for providing those additional incentives?
The question is for anyone who wants to answer that.
Would Lauren like to jump in?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Lauren, if you wanted to jump in.
Maybe she wasn't able to hear.
No, I was going to say, unfortunately, I wasn't able to fully hear it. Can someone repeat the question?
You want to repeat the question, and then
The question is,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
yeah, it's no better. No, the question is mostly if can you incentivize savings? Can you encourage this, and perhaps giving more fertilizer I think it's a kind of either the equivalent of a discount or giving more quantity of the fertilizers at the time when you buy it. Can you actually change some of these behaviors? Right? Do you want to jump in, Lauren?
Sorry, the question is, can you incentivize savings to encourage people to use more inputs?
Incentivize input purchase and savings by providing more fertilizers for the given price when you purchase, right?
Through a subsidy, for example?
To encourage fertilizer, or the same thing for savings. I think it kind of, the match savings was also a little bit of the story. You give a 50% addition on people who are saving as a way to promote some of these savings, right?
Yeah,
Lauren?
yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I certainly think, to the extent that we think people might be under saving relative to, especially if there's some sort of time inconsistency, I think encouraging savings can certainly be helpful. And it's an interesting question about the best way to do it, whether, you should do it through something like a lockbox at home, or providing some incentives through, it sounded like there was some scheme here about maybe incentives through discounts or additional quantities. And that might have, if there's some learning going on, like Rachid and Michael, you've shown in your work, then potentially that can have additional benefits, I think, through kind of the experience of experiencing the returns. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea and an interesting model.
Maybe I can just say one more thing. I mean, one of the results from the Duflo-Kramer-Robinson paper, and one of the results we found too when we did a similar type of experiment in Burkina Faso and providing people with price subsidies, so reducing the price of fertilizer, was that people still preferred the behavioral mechanisms by having the early commitment contract and the longer time horizon relative to subsidies during the planting season. And one of the reasons is because of this kind of their ability to have a longer time horizon to plan the agricultural season. So having a subsidy, I think when the subsidy comes, is really important in thinking about the design of those programs. Because even if you make something really cheap during planting season, but people haven't been able to prepare for the season, they're not going to be able to realize a good return on that investment. So from Kenya, in the Duflo-Kramer-Robinson paper, we have evidence that providing the earlier commitment mechanism has a higher rate on adoption of fertilizer purchases than providing a 50% subsidy. And we have similar evidence also from Burkina Faso, which shows a slightly smaller subsidy and a softer commitment mechanism. And again, we find adoption rates are much higher when you provide people this kind of behavioral contract. The other thing that I would say too is, from the perspective of liquidity, we can think about this perspective from we can think about the role of subsidies from the farmer perspective, but from a policy perspective, who sustains those subsidies? And so one of the things that I think that's interesting about the work on behavioral mechanisms is if we can increase fertilizer demand and develop the private sector, then that's potentially a longer term welfare improving equilibrium for markets to actually develop in these places that don't have markets, right? And it's a way to increase revenue and profitability for the ag input dealers, who are also poor small enterprises. I mean, the ag input dealers that are running around in rural Mali aren't wealthy ag input dealers, right? Those guys live in the capital city or in secondary cities. So when we think about expanding market access, we need to think about liquidity constrained ag input dealers too, right? And they're not going to be able to provide subsidies to farmers to increase the demand. So how do those businesses grow? Some of these behavioral mechanisms reinforce and provide them liquidity in an important season when they can procure stocks, right, to ensure delivery during the planting season. And hence, there's a reinforcing mechanism that happens between both the demand side and the supply side that actually might create markets. So that's one of the things that I think is interesting to think about, not only these constraints from a farmer perspective, but also how are they integrated from a market perspective, and can introducing innovations in contracting in the agricultural sector actually provide incentives, resolve constraints on both the supply side and the demand side of the market.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rachid, Andrew, and Lauren online. Appreciate that. So we are wrapping up for today.